You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal Node System MNS Presentation 1175 Excel chords named by mode and modal half steps. Presentation list on the right. We plan on adding plenty more to them shortly. Also noting that in this OneNote presentation, we could spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we also have multiple similarly numbered and named presentations where we build out these tables in Excel, practicing both our Excel tools and our music theory at the same time. So what we want to do here is think about the construction of the chords, and let's get a quick idea as to why there could be a problem with the current naming conventions. And the general thing I want to be putting in our mind all the time is there an easier way to be doing the current process than has been historically been put together? And I think oftentimes with music theory, the answer is yes, because we have more information at this time. And then the question is, well, if I learn it that way, is the speed that I will do it, because I'm going to be going as the crow flies, worth it, so that I then have to bridge the gap so I can communicate to the current method? And usually it's going to be easier. Why? Because again, you're going to learn it in the most streamlined way possible, as the crow flies, and then you're going to be bridging that to the current system, winding around the mountains and doing everything you have to do, jumping through the hoops that the bureaucrats make you jump through in order to communicate the stuff. So how does that relate here? Let's do our analogy, remembering that our fretboard is going to be our map of the territory. We're going to compare it to the globe. We're going to say that there's 7 continents. Now, those continents repeat, but there's only 7 continents on the globe. Now, there's 12 actual locations, but the non-continent locations are going to be the oceans. We go through them to land on the continents. We're going to imagine our perspective from space, like our head up here over the fretboard. The fretboard, by the way, having the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. We then imagine the fretboard spinning around like the globe does. It's rotating to the right, let's say. And we can imagine we assign it 12 different points of rotation, so all the continents are rotating around. Well, then we need to name them 1 through 12. Those are going to be the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. If we say we want to name our vantage point number 4, the C vantage point, then the fretboard would look like this. And once I locate the locations, like this square right here, then that square will always have the same continent names, which are not the note names. They are you could say Nashville number system names, or they're the modes, the Ionian, the Lydian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, the Dorian, the Aeolian. So that's the idea. If we shift it up to the right, then you're going to have a C sharp, but the whole thing will be shifted up. And therefore, this will have the same name, which would be the Ionian. So that means that what we want to do is look at the vantage point and then memorize the thing that's completely shiftable, which on the guitar, because it's a symmetrical instrument, is even more shiftable than any other instrument. Well, most other, like the piano. I always compare it to the piano because the piano is the baseline instrument that we built the music theory on. Beautiful instrument, but that did lead to certain things that might be complicating the system a little bit, particularly if we're on a guitar, which is completely symmetrical. So that's the idea. What's the problem then? Well, if we do terminology for distances, it's often a little wonky, meaning if we have intervals, then the intervals are going to force us to rename our system from the vantage point of the scale degrees. We don't want to do that. Typically, what I'd like to do is measure the distance. Similarly, with chord name constructions, the chords are going to be named based off of scale degrees. And they're also going to be named which chord you're going to play based off of those scale degrees. So if you're in the major key, most people learn that the 1, 4, 5 builds major chords. So you play off the 1, you play off the 4, and you play off the 5, and you memorize that there's bar chords basically there. But we'd like to be able to say, hey, look, these are different. They're all in the same diatonic key. So the 1, 4, 5 actually have different shapes related to them. It's the same shape if you just look at a 3-note triad, but it's still a different location on the fretboard. We'd like to identify that. And if you expand beyond the triad, it's a different shape. So that's one problem. The other problem is if we play in some other mode other than the Ionian, say the Aeolian, which is the minor key, then the minor key, they're going to shift the 6 to the 1. They're going to rename the continent in a scale degree system. That becomes a problem because I'd rather say, look, I'm going to play all the minors, which would be a 6, 2, 3. But they're going to want us to change it to a 1, 4, 5 in the minor key. So that means I have to re-memorize my whole continent when I choose a different tonal center. What does that lead to? It leads to people being very good playing in the major key and not being able to memorize the other keys because they haven't taken the effort to basically re-memorize the number system and know when they can play major and minor chords. But you shouldn't do that. You don't need to do that. You should, if you keep the same numbering system and just use the change to the modal center, then it's going to be easier to do. Also, when we actually construct the chords, if I construct like this D, this is a Dorian chord. If I construct off of this chord, then we would call that a minor triad that we would be making. To build it, we would make this the 1. So we'd make this the 1, and that's not what we want to do because we'd say it's a 1, 3, 5 that would be built off of it. What I'd rather do is say, no, let's keep that as the 2 and then say, look, there's a distance of 2 modal whole steps. That's how we can build it. Alternatively, getting to the same end result, but in a way that we don't have to rename the points on the fretboard. So let's see what that would look like. All right. So we're going to say, let's look at our building blocks. We've got all of our notes. Now I'm going to name the notes this way, give them a number and a letter. The sharps and flats I'm going to call A, B. Those are the ones that are between the A and the B. So these are the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. Those are going to be naming our perspective generally. And then once we know the perspective, I would say that you want to spend most of your time memorizing the continents, the modes, the Nashville number system, if you want to see it that way. And then we have the 7 notes. Now we're going to be using the key of C, which is customary because it has that nice internal control check, which is going to be that there's no sharps and flats in it. Now that's kind of an arbitrary thing. We've talked about that before, but it does work as a nice internal control. So if we apply our formula, we go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. We get to 7 notes out of the 12 notes. Now, these 7 notes are still, you can imagine them as the continents on the globe, but the continents, you can imagine them kind of like they are on the globe, are like in a circle. Like we only go in a circle. We're not going zigzag to the continents, really. We're going to say that they always go around in a circle for the distance. So you're going around the block, around the continents. You go around the block for all of the notes in the musical alphabet. So how do we build chords then? We take the 7 notes and then we skip every other note from whatever node that we are on. That's the same no matter what chord construction convention that we use. So if I want to build minor chords, we start on the Ionian and we skip every other note. A triad would be the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, right? If I went to the next major mode would be the Lydian, I skip every other note, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. Now, most people don't name them by the node names. They name them by the letters. But although that might have functionality on the piano, which is not symmetrical, that might help you know where your fingering is because the black keys aren't going to line up all the same way. It's not helpful on the guitar. It's way more helpful to name the nodes in the system because those are completely movable. Right? We want to do things that are completely movable on the guitar. I think you would want to do that on the piano as well, but I'm not going to make the argument for the piano. Maybe there's something I don't understand on the piano, but on the guitar, clearly we want to make it completely movable. I mean, it's just obvious. That's how that's what you want to do, right? So you want to name it by the nodes typically. All right, so that's going to be the idea. Now we'll get into the idea of major and minor, but we'll talk more about that later once we get into the intervals. So we'll revisit the chords after we talk about intervals. Right now, we just want to intuitively note you can build the chords without even knowing the intervals, really. because you can just start on whatever node you're in and just skip every other note because you know the 7 notes and they're in order like going around the block. Now the current system doesn't really list it that way, and that's why it's a little bit confusing. So let me show you what I mean. We're going to imagine that we've got the 7 modes, so we're going to name them 1 through 7. That's like the Nashville number system. I'm not going to change the numbering system when the scale degree changes. That's going to be the difference. I want to keep that the same. That, if you were to build the system from scratch today, would be the way, this is just a system, a computer programmer, an engineer, that's what they would do. Right? Why? Because it makes sense. It's the most makes sense thing to do. Okay, so we want to do the thing that makes most sense. Why? Because it's going to be easier to learn it that way. So then I'm going to give it a letter. Ionian's going to be a small I, Dorian a small d, Phrygian a small p, Lydian a small y, Mixolydian an x, Aeolian an a, Locrian an n. Why do we have the y for Lydian? Because I don't want to make a small l. Why do we have an x for Mixolydian? Because the m's look like major or minor, so I picked an x. Why n for Locrian? Because I don't want a small l because it looks like a 1 and it's crazy, so I can think of the n as it's backwards, right? So the Locrian's backwards, so we take the back letter if you want to memorize it. Now, if it's the tonic, if we're building a chord and it's the tonic and we use these letters in the chord construction, we can actually show whether the chord is the tonic, meaning the home base, the tonal center, or not, by capitalizing it or not, which you can't really do in the current naming convention. All right, so this is going to be the modes, the Ionian, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian. We have also a short name for them. I'm just going to give it the 3-letter Ion, Dor, Phryg, Lydian, Mix, Aeolian, Locrian. All right, so then let's start with a 3-note major chord. So if these are our list of notes, we're going to start on the Ionian. Remember that this is true for all 12 notes. There's nothing special about the key of C, right? It's just the one that happened to be historically what we always work with and what they happen to, use what they call the natural notes because it came first and then they jammed in all the sharps and flats. But in theory, there's nothing special about it. So if I shifted my perspective on the guitar to C sharp, to B, to C, to D or whatever, it would all be the same, right? All the 7 notes would be all parallel. They'd all shift up the same. So the chord construction would be the same. We just happen to be on the C here. How do we make a triad? What you do is you take your scale, or I'm just going to say my collection of notes that are in order, and I'm going to start on the node that is the C and just skip every other note. So it would be Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. That's the same no matter what. Now the naming convention is where it gets a little wonky. So what are we going to call it? A C major or just a C? It's defaulted as the C. So you don't really have to say major, but if you want to clarify that it's major versus minor, you can put then C major. That's the way the current system basically works. If you just see a C in the context of a chord, we assume it's major unless it says otherwise. But if you want to be more clear, you can say it's a C major. And sometimes you might use a capital M versus a lowercase m for major or minor. Now, note that the context here, when I say major, that basically kind of makes it like modes don't exist, right? Because a lot of people don't even know that the major is the Ionian mode. So they kind of pulled out the Ionian mode, they threw away the mode name and said, this is the major mode. The king of modes is kind of what seems to be happening here.